The courtroom was alive with tension as Sarah Carter stood at the center, her heart pounding in her chest. At just 16, she was out of place in this intimidating space, surrounded by seasoned attorneys and a judge whose every glance seemed to dismiss her presence. The audience murmured among themselves, unsure whether to pity the teenager or admire her audacity. The judge, Judge Harris, sat at the bench, a mocking smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as he glanced over his notes. With a sharp crack of the gavel, the court fell silent. Judge Harris leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain as he addressed Sarah. "You think you can stand here and defend yourself against me?" He sneered, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized her. "You're just a kid." "What, 16? Go back to school, kid. This is no place for you." A wave of uneasy chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The audience was divided. Some seemed amused, while others looked uncomfortable. But Sarah didn't flinch. She stood tall, her posture unwavering as she gazed directly at the judge. There was no doubt in her mind that she belonged here, in this very moment, despite the odds stacked against her. Her voice, calm yet firm, cut through the tension. "Your Honor," she said, not missing a beat, "with all due respect, the Constitution doesn't say you need a law degree to defend yourself. It says everyone has the right to a fair trial, and I'm going to make sure I get one." The room fell into stunned silence. Even Judge Harris seemed momentarily taken aback by the audacity of the teenager standing before him. For a brief second, his smug expression faltered. But before anyone could react, Sarah reached into her worn backpack and pulled out a stack of papers. Holding them up, she declared, "These," she said confidently, "are legal precedents, and I've studied every one of them. Let me show you exactly why you're wrong." Gasps filled the room as Sarah began to flip through the pages, each one representing hours of meticulous study. She wasn't some naive kid. She was a teenager who had spent the last few weeks poring over legal texts, building her case. The judge's mocking smirk faded as Sarah began to read aloud from one of the precedents. Her voice was sharp, deliberate, and filled with a sense of purpose. She quoted case law with ease, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. As Sarah continued to present her arguments, Judge Harris's expression shifted. His mocking amusement turned into something that resembled disbelief. His eyes widened, and, for the first time, he seemed to be questioning his own position. The judge's face was no longer a picture of smug superiority, but one of uncertainty. He gripped his gavel tighter, clearly rattled. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The stenographer's fingers hovered hesitantly over the keys, unsure whether to continue typing. The entire room was hanging on Sarah's every word. And still, Sarah wasn't done. She wasn't about to stop until she had proven her point. She flipped to another page, this time reading from a case that had directly addressed procedural errors in courtrooms like this one. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice unwavering, "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to make sure that justice is served, and I will not let this court violate my constitutional rights just because I'm young." A ripple of gasps spread through the room. No one had ever seen a teenager stand up to a judge in this way. Sarah was doing more than defending herself. She was challenging the very system that had been set up to intimidate and silence people like her. Judge Harris slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing through the courtroom. "Enough!" he shouted, but there was a note of panic in his voice. "This is nonsense. You're out of line, Miss Carter." Sarah paused, raising an eyebrow. "Are you sure, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice dripping with calm authority. "Or would you like me to explain why your objections violate procedural law?" The room froze. All eyes turned to the judge, whose face was now crimson with anger and embarrassment. It was clear that no one had ever dared speak to him this way before, least of all a 16-year-old girl. For a moment, the courtroom was utterly silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. But just then, the bailiff leaned in to whisper something to Judge Harris. Sarah caught the words clearly, as if they were meant just for her. The judge muttered a single word under his breath, barely audible. Impossible. Impossible. How could this teenage girl, a kid who was supposed to be naive and uninformed, have the entire courtroom, including the judge, questioning everything they knew about the law? How could she be so sure of herself, so confident, and so well prepared? The truth was, Sarah had no idea how she had gotten here. A month ago, she never imagined she would be standing in this courtroom, defending herself against charges she didn't commit. She had been an ordinary high school junior from Cedarville, a small town in the Midwest. Her days had been filled with studying science, volunteering at the local animal shelter, and spending time with her family. Life had been simple, predictable, until that one fateful day when everything changed. It all started with her dad. Life had always been simple for Sarah Carter. She was a high school junior in Cedarville, a small town tucked away in the Midwest. Her days revolved around routine, waking up early to catch the bus to school, spending her afternoons volunteering at the local animal shelter, and evenings spent studying for exams. Science was her passion, though she struggled with math, and her weekends were usually spent helping her mom in the garden or reading. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about her life, but to Sarah, it was perfect. She had a family she loved, a small but tight-knit group of friends, and a community that felt safe. That all changed on a crisp December morning. It was early when Sarah's dad, Tom Carter, drove her to school. The frost on the windshield sparkled in the early light as the car rumbled down the quiet streets of Cedarville. They had just crossed the town's border when the familiar red and blue lights of a police car flashed behind them. Tom frowned and pulled the car over to the side of the road, sighing in frustration. He'd always tried to keep his record clean. No speeding tickets, no parking violations, but it seemed like he'd missed something. The officer approached the car with a practiced ease, a look of indifference on his face. "Good morning, sir," the officer said, his tone polite but firm. "I'm pulling you over because your taillight is out." Tom nodded, glancing in the rearview mirror at Sarah. "I didn't even know." "Thanks for letting me know, officer," he said, his voice calm but a little stressed. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her mind already wandering, thinking about the history test she'd forgotten to study for. The officer, however, didn't seem to be in a hurry to let them go. "I'm going to need to check your license and registration," he said, and Sarah could hear the faint clicking of his radio. She watched the officer take a few steps back, dialing something into his walkie-talkie. Her dad shifted uncomfortably, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The officer hadn't even mentioned the taillight until now, and everything felt too formal for such a minor issue. Then came the next words that changed everything. "Mr. Carter, I'm going to have to place you under arrest." The words hit Sarah like a slap in the face. She looked at her dad in disbelief, her heart skipping a beat. "What?" she gasped, her voice rising in panic. The officer didn't answer, instead motioning for Tom to step out of the car. "You're being arrested for outstanding parking tickets. There are multiple unpaid fines linked to your vehicle." Sarah's stomach turned. Her father, arrested? For something so trivial as parking tickets? She tried to make sense of what was happening, but the more she thought about it, the less sense it made. The officer had simply pulled them over for a minor infraction. But now, her dad was being handcuffed and escorted toward the squad car as if he were a criminal. "No! This can't be happening!" Sarah shouted, stumbling out of the car. She ran toward the officer, her voice pleading. "There's been a mistake. He didn't know about the tickets. You have to let him go." The officer didn't respond, his gaze hard and unyielding. "Step back, miss," he said, his voice cold. But Sarah couldn't stop herself. She kept running after them, feeling like she was living in some sort of nightmare. The tears came faster now as she watched her dad being pushed into the back of the police car. She reached out, her hands trembling, but the officer stepped between them, blocking her path. "Get back in the car," he ordered, his voice sharp. Sarah froze, her world spinning. She felt helpless, a sense of panic rising in her chest. Her dad, who had always been there to support her, who had worked so hard to take care of their family, was now being treated like a criminal. For parking tickets. Everything felt wrong. Later that week, Sarah sat in a cold courtroom with her mom beside her, the echo of the gavel still ringing in her ears. The trial was brief. The charges against her father were simple. Unpaid parking tickets that had gone unnoticed. The fines had piled up, and because Tom couldn't afford to pay them, he was sentenced to 30 days in jail. 30 days, for something that seemed so insignificant. Sarah's mind raced as the judge passed down the sentence. This was it. The moment her whole world changed. She had spent her whole life believing in the fairness of the system, trusting that it worked for people like her and her family. But now, staring at her dad, sitting in that orange jumpsuit behind bars, she wasn't so sure anymore. "How could this happen?" Sarah whispered to her mom, her voice breaking. "It's just parking tickets. How is that fair?" Her mother's eyes were red from crying, but she remained silent. There was nothing to say. The injustice was undeniable. This wasn't just about the tickets anymore. This was about something much bigger. The realization that the system wasn't as just as Sarah had always thought. It wasn't about making sure people were treated fairly. It was about money, power, and who could afford to navigate the system. And right now, Sarah felt like she was on the wrong side of it. The following weeks after her father's sentencing were a blur for Sarah. Her mind kept replaying that horrifying moment on the side of the road, seeing her dad in handcuffs, the way he was treated like a criminal for something so trivial. Every time she thought about it, a deep sense of anger and helplessness surged inside her. She couldn't understand how something so small could lead to such a massive injustice. Her dad wasn't a criminal. He was a good man, a hard-working man who just happened to miss a few parking tickets in a sea of responsibilities. Yet, he was now locked behind bars, while people who committed far worse crimes walked free. The system, she realized, didn't care about fairness. It only cared about money. But it wasn't just her father's case that kept her awake at night. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself in a nightmare of her own, one that she couldn't have possibly predicted. It started like any other evening. Sarah had spent the day at the library, studying for a test she had in history, trying to keep her mind occupied so it didn't drift back to thoughts of her father. She hated how quiet the house was without him. Her mom did her best to stay upbeat, but Sarah could see the worry in her eyes every time she glanced at the empty chair at the dinner table. It was as if the absence of Tom cast a shadow over everything. That night, as Sarah was walking home from the library, the streets were unusually empty. The cold air bit at her skin, but she welcomed the chill, hoping it would numb the anxiety gnawing at her. The sky was darkening quickly, the few streetlights flickering above her as she walked past the old neighborhood. Up ahead, She saw two older boys from her school standing on the sidewalk, arguing loudly. They were in her grade, but Sarah had never spoken to them much. Kyle and Mark were known to be troublemakers, often caught in fights or causing some kind of ruckus. She didn't want to get involved, so she kept her head down, hoping they wouldn't notice her as she passed by. But then she heard a loud shove. The sound of Mark stumbling and hitting a mailbox rang out through the night, followed by a shout. "Hey, she did it!" Before Sarah could even comprehend what was happening, Kyle pointed directly at her, his voice accusing. She pushed him. Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. "What?" she cried out, taking a step back. She was in shock, her mind racing. How could they be accusing her of something she hadn't done? She hadn't even been near them when it happened. "Call the cops!" someone yelled from behind her, and before she could react, two strangers emerged from the shadows, backing up Kyle's claim. In a split second, the situation spiraled out of control. The police were called, and within minutes, an officer arrived on the scene. Sarah was still standing there, too stunned to speak, her mouth dry as the words caught in her throat. Mark was holding his head, playing the victim, while Kyle's finger was still pointed at her. It felt surreal. How could this be happening? "Miss Carter," the officer said, as he approached her, his voice stern. "We're taking you in for questioning. You're under arrest for assault." "Wait!" Sarah gasped, finally finding her voice. "I didn't do anything. I didn't push him. I swear." But her protests fell on deaf ears. The officer didn't listen to her. He didn't care that she was a straight-A student, or that she had never been in trouble before. He didn't care that she had never even spoken to Mark or Kyle until that moment. She was being arrested. End of story. The ride to the police station felt like an eternity. Every bump in the road felt like a new blow to her sense of reality. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. How could this be her life now? First, her dad, and now this? It didn't make sense. It was as though the world had shifted beneath her feet, and everything she thought she knew about fairness had been ripped away in an instant. When Sarah arrived at the police station, her mom wasn't there yet. She was alone in a cold holding room, the harsh fluorescent lights above her making everything feel even more surreal. Her heart raced in her chest as she tried to think of what to do next. She didn't have a lawyer. She didn't even know how the legal system worked. Not really. She had been taught to trust it, to believe that it was there to protect her. But now, she was starting to question everything. It was then that the public defender showed up, a man named Mr. Jenkins. He was older, his hair thinning, and his suit a little too big for him, but he still managed to carry himself with an air of authority. "Miss Carter," he said, introducing himself, "I'm going to be representing you for now." Sarah tried to explain the situation, but it was clear that Mr. Jenkins wasn't listening. He barely made eye contact, flipping through paperwork as if he had other places to be. When she mentioned that she was innocent, that she hadn't touched Mark, he simply nodded. "Look, kid," he said, glancing up at her with mild impatience. "You're going to want to take the plea deal. It's the best option for you. The evidence is stacked against you." Sarah's stomach twisted in knots. "But I didn't do it," she protested, her voice breaking. Mr. Jenkins sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I understand, but the court doesn't care about your side of the story. The key is to minimize the damage. Taking a plea deal will reduce your sentence." Sarah shook her head, her hands shaking as she fought to hold back tears. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not going to plead guilty to something I didn't do." "Kid, you don't get it," Mr. Jenkins muttered, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "The system doesn't care about your innocence. It cares about getting cases closed. Trust me, you don't want to fight this, You're just going to make things worse for yourself." But Sarah refused to back down. She wasn't going to let the system swallow her whole. She may not have known much about the law, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't guilty. And she wasn't going to let anyone, especially a public defender, tell her otherwise. So, in that moment, a decision was made. She would fight this, no matter what. When her mom arrived later, she was devastated to find out that Sarah had refused the plea deal. "Sarah, you're just a kid," her mom said, tears in her eyes. "You can't fight the entire court by yourself." "I have to, Mom," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear threatening to break her. "If I don't fight, I've already lost." And with that resolve, Sarah made a vow to herself. She would learn everything she could about the law. She would defend herself. She would prove her innocence, no matter the cost. The days that followed her decision to represent herself were filled with long hours and sleepless nights. Sarah knew she was venturing into unknown territory, and she had no time to waste. The case against her seemed overwhelming. False testimonies, a police report that contradicted her version of events, and a public defender who had already written her off. But she refused to let the system decide her fate without a fight. Every free moment Sarah had, she spent at the library. The local Cedarville library became her sanctuary, a place where she could immerse herself in law books and legal precedents, trying to make sense of the complexities of the system. Mrs. Jenkins, the librarian, had noticed Sarah's growing presence and had offered her a quiet corner to work. Over time, Mrs. Jenkins became Sarah's unofficial mentor, guiding her through the maze of legal jargon and offering words of encouragement when Sarah felt overwhelmed. "I know it's hard, dear," Mrs. Jenkins would say, "but you've got the fire in you. That's the most important thing." Sarah took Mrs. Jenkins's words to heart. It wasn't enough to just read the books. She needed to understand them, to digest every piece of information until it became second nature. It wasn't easy. There were times when Sarah's eyes would blur from the pages, her mind aching from the weight of the terms she was learning. Terms like burden of proof, due process, and reasonable doubt felt foreign to her at first. But Sarah had never been one to back down from a challenge, and she threw herself into the work with a fierce determination. The more she read, the more she began to understand. She learned about her rights, the right to remain silent, the right to a fair trial, the right to confront witnesses. She pored over case law, familiarizing herself with precedents that could help her. Each day she spent in the library brought her closer to a sense of clarity. She wasn't just a high school junior anymore. She was becoming something more, a fighter. But there were moments of doubt, too. Sarah was aware that many of the people around her, including her mother, thought she was crazy for taking on the entire legal system by herself. Her classmates mocked her, calling her Lawyer Barbie, and laughing at her efforts to represent herself. The whispers in the hallway were hard to ignore, and Sarah often found herself questioning if she was making a huge mistake. One evening, as Sarah sat hunched over a stack of legal books, her mother came into the room, her face a mixture of concern and worry. "Sarah, honey, I know you're doing your best, but this is too much for you," her mom said, sitting beside her. "You're just a kid. This isn't something you can win on your own." But Sarah refused to let her mother's words deter her. "Mom, if I don't do this, I've already lost. I can't let them get away with lying about me." Her mother sighed deeply, tears welling up in her eyes. "But what if you fail? What happens to you then?" "I won't fail," Sarah replied, her voice firm despite the uncertainty in her heart. "I have to keep fighting. If I don't, they'll just keep doing this to people like us, people who don't have a voice, Her mother didn't say anything after that, but Sarah could see the sadness in her eyes. It hurt her to see her mom like this, to know that her mother was scared for her, but Sarah couldn't back down. The injustice of her father's arrest and the false accusations against her were too much to bear. She had to take a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that didn't care. By the time the trial started, Sarah had become more than just a high school student. She was a self-taught legal researcher, armed with a binder full of case law and legal precedents. Her confidence was growing, but she knew the hardest part was still ahead of her. Standing in front of Judge Harris, facing the prosecution, and defending herself in a room full of people who had already decided she was guilty. The morning of the trial arrived quickly. Sarah's stomach churned with nerves, but she couldn't afford to show it. She had spent hours preparing her opening statement, rehearsing it in front of her mirror until the words felt like they belonged to her. As she walked into the courtroom that morning, she felt like she was stepping into the unknown, but there was no turning back now. The room was packed with spectators, most of them there to see the spectacle of a teenager representing herself in court. Sarah could hear the whispers as she made her way to the defendant's table, her heart racing in her chest. It was hard to ignore the judgmental stares, the skepticism in the air, but Sarah had come too far to let it affect her. Judge Harris sat at the bench, his eyes glinting with disdain as he looked down at her. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone condescending, "are you ready to make your case?" Sarah straightened her spine and nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready." The trial began in earnest. The prosecutor, Mr. Blake, a seasoned lawyer with years of experience, wasted no time in trying to discredit Sarah. He sneered at her opening statement, rolling his eyes when she cited case law, and even laughed out loud when she quoted a legal precedent that supported her defense. But Sarah didn't let it rattle her. She stayed focused, keeping her cool as Mr. Blake attempted to undermine her every move. Each time he interrupted her, each time he mocked her efforts, she grew more determined. She wasn't just defending herself. She was standing up to a system that was stacked against her, a system that didn't think she could win. During the first few days of the trial, Sarah found herself increasingly frustrated. Judge Harris seemed to have already made up his mind about her guilt. He interrupted her whenever she spoke, often rolling his eyes or sighing loudly. During her cross-examination of the witnesses, he made sarcastic remarks, clearly unconcerned with giving her a fair shot. It was as if he viewed her as nothing more than a nuisance, someone too young and naive to understand the complexity of the court. The pressure weighed heavily on her, and there were times when she wanted to give up, to walk out of the courtroom and forget the whole thing. But the thought of her father behind bars, the thought of all the people who had been wronged by a system that didn't care about them, it pushed her forward. Sarah was not about to let them win. She couldn't. On the fourth day of the trial, something unexpected happened. As Sarah sat at the defense table, flipping through her binder for the next case she planned to present, she overheard a conversation between the prosecution and the judge. They were speaking in hushed tones, but Sarah was close enough to hear the words. The judge muttered something under his breath, but Sarah caught it loud and clear. Impossible. She didn't know what they were discussing, but the tension in the air told her that something had shifted. For the first time in days, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to turn the tide. But she couldn't afford to get distracted. She had to stay focused and keep pushing forward. Sarah was beginning to feel the weight of the trial pressing down on her. With every passing day, it became more apparent how deeply entrenched the corruption was. Judge Harris seemed to have already decided her fate. He dismissed her arguments with a wave of his hand, mocking her legal knowledge, and refused to acknowledge her hard work. The courtroom atmosphere was thick with hostility, and the prosecution, led by the experienced Mr. Blake, was doing everything in its power to discredit Sarah and make her seem like a nuisance rather than someone who deserved a fair trial. But despite everything, Sarah refused to give up. On the 5th day of the trial, things took a turn for the worse. Mr. Blake, looking more smug than ever, called his first witness to the stand. It was Mark, one of the boys who had accused Sarah of pushing him. The moment Mark opened his mouth, Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. He began to recount his version of events, painting Sarah as the aggressor who had shoved him to the ground. He even claimed that she had threatened him earlier in the day, something that Sarah knew was a lie. The story Mark was telling was completely fabricated. Sarah could tell immediately that he was lying through his teeth. He hesitated, his words stumbling over each other as he tried to make his version of the events fit the narrative that the prosecution had built. But his lies were so obvious that Sarah could hardly believe the court was taking him seriously. As Mark continued his testimony, Sarah took notes, her mind racing. She had to find a way to expose him for the liar he was. But she also knew that the more she argued, the more Judge Harris would try to shut her down. She had to stay calm, and she had to wait for the right moment to strike. After Mark's testimony, it was time for Sarah to cross-examine him. The moment she stood up, the courtroom fell silent. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her. Some were skeptical, others were waiting for her to fail. But Sarah wasn't about to let them see her fear. She took a deep breath and approached the witness stand, her mind sharp and focused. "Mark," Sarah began, her voice steady, "you say that I pushed you, that I was the one who caused this incident. But can you explain something to me?" Mark's eyes shifted nervously. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice lacking confidence. Sarah didn't hesitate. "You claim that I shoved you into a mailbox. But if that's true, then why is there a witness who saw us standing on opposite sides of the street when the incident occurred?" She turned to the jury, making sure everyone was paying attention. "How could I have pushed you if we weren't even near each other when it happened?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was caught in his own lie. Sarah pressed on. "And tell me, Mark, why are you so sure it was me? Why did you point directly at me when you were asked who pushed you?" She didn't give him time to answer. "You couldn't have known it was me. I wasn't even close to you. And yet, you're standing here, accusing me of something I didn't do. Why?" Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked at the judge for guidance, but Judge Harris didn't say a word. Mark opened his mouth again, but it was clear that he couldn't come up with a convincing response. His testimony had started to fall apart, and Sarah knew this was her chance to show the court the truth. But just as she was about to press for more, Mr. Blake stood up, his voice cutting through the tension. "Objection, Your Honor," he said. "This line of questioning is irrelevant." Judge Harris glanced at Sarah before turning his gaze back to the prosecutor. "Sustained," he said coldly. "Move on, Miss Carter." Sarah's frustration simmered beneath the surface. She wanted to push further, to make Mark admit the truth, but Judge Harris wasn't giving her a chance. She had been shut down again. But she couldn't give up. Not now. Not after all she had been through. As the trial continued, Sarah faced more and more lies. Each time a new witness was called, she could see the same pattern emerging. They all had something to hide, something they were being forced to say. The lies were growing more outrageous, but the prosecution was relentless. Each fabricated testimony getting more absurd than the last. One of the next witnesses was Kyle, the other boy who had been with Mark that day. He testified that Sarah had been angry with Mark and that she had shouted at him before the altercation. According to Kyle, Sarah had provoked the fight. His story was completely different from Sarah's recollection of events. In her mind, she had never been close enough to either of the boys to say anything to them, let alone provoke a fight. Kyle's testimony was another piece of fiction designed to paint her as the villain. Sarah was infuriated, but she didn't show it. She had learned the hard way that reacting impulsively in the courtroom wouldn't help her case. Instead, she decided to take a more measured approach. She would use Kyle's testimony against him. During her cross-examination, she took her time. "Kyle," she began, her voice cool, "you said that I provoked the fight. But you were standing across the street, weren't you?" Kyle hesitated. I guess," he stammered. "I was far away, but I could still hear." "Then how could you possibly know what happened between me and Mark?" Sarah interrupted, her tone firm. "If you weren't close enough to hear what we were saying, how can you testify to what was said? You can't. Your testimony is based on assumptions and not facts. And you're lying to this court." Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at the judge for reassurance. "I didn't lie," he muttered. "You're lying now, Kyle," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "And I can prove it." Before she could continue, Mr. Blake objected, but Sarah wasn't finished. She had already laid the groundwork. The inconsistencies in Kyle's story were starting to add up, and she wasn't going to let them go unnoticed. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order!" he barked. "Miss Carter, you will refrain from making accusations without evidence." "I'm not accusing anyone, Your Honor," Sarah said calmly. "I'm just pointing out the flaws in their testimonies. It's clear that neither Mark nor Kyle are telling the truth. The prosecution is using false witnesses to build a case against me." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. But she knew that the fight wasn't over. The prosecution would continue to push their narrative, no matter how many lies they had to tell. The next few days in court were a whirlwind of legal maneuvering and emotional turmoil. Sarah had come to realize that despite her best efforts, the system she had once believed in so wholeheartedly was rigged against her. Judge Harris was increasingly hostile, dismissing her arguments with quick, sarcastic remarks. The prosecution, led by Mr. Blake, was relentless in their pursuit of a conviction, and their fabricated testimonies continued to mount, threatening to swallow her whole. It seemed like the more Sarah fought to prove her innocence, the deeper she sank into the web of lies that the court had already spun around her. But even as Sarah felt the weight of the case pressing down on her, she never lost sight of her goal: to find the truth. She spent every night poring over case law and legal texts, tirelessly searching for anything that could help her win. In the dim light of her bedroom, she flipped through page after page, trying to find a way to break through the prosecution's carefully constructed narrative. Then, one evening, as Sarah was reviewing the details of the case, something caught her eye. She had been so focused on the witness testimony and legal arguments that she had almost missed it: the mention of a nearby traffic camera. The camera, located at the intersection just a few yards from the scene of the incident, could potentially provide crucial evidence that would exonerate her. Her heart raced as she realized what this meant. If the camera had captured footage of the incident, it could prove once and for all that she was innocent. The footage would show that she had been nowhere near the altercation, that the entire accusation against her was a lie. But the problem was that the footage had never been included in the evidence presented by either side. It had simply been overlooked, ignored, by both the prosecution and the defense. Sarah's mind was spinning. This was her breakthrough. But the process of obtaining the footage wouldn't be easy. She would have to petition the court for it, and there was no guarantee that Judge Harris would allow it. The judge had already shown a clear bias against her, and she knew that he would fight her every step of the way. Still, she couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip through her fingers. This was her chance to turn the tide. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the courthouse with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the footage from the traffic camera could be the key to her defense. She had spent the entire night drafting a petition to the court, asking for the footage to be subpoenaed as evidence. She wasn't sure how Judge Harris would respond, but she was determined to make her case. When the trial began, Sarah stood up in the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her, waiting for her to speak. The tension in the room was thick, and she knew that the moment she requested the footage, the judge would have to decide whether to grant it or not. There was no turning back. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy buzzing in her veins, "I've recently discovered that there is a traffic camera located near the scene of the incident. I request that the footage be subpoenaed as evidence." Judge Harris raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Sarah's boldness. He glanced at the prosecution, who was frowning, and then back at Sarah. "A traffic camera?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "And you expect me to delay proceedings to review this footage?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied confidently. "I believe the footage will show that I was not involved in the incident in any way. It will prove that I was not near the altercation when it occurred, and it will clear my name." The room fell silent as Judge Harris considered her request. Sarah held her breath, hoping beyond hope that he would allow the footage to be reviewed. She knew that this was her last chance to expose the truth, to show the court the evidence that would finally prove her innocence. After a tense moment, Judge Harris sighed heavily. "Very well," he said, his voice reluctant. "The footage will be reviewed. But if this turns out to be a waste of time, you will regret it, Miss Carter." A small wave of relief washed over Sarah as the judge granted her request. But she knew that this was only the beginning. The footage had to be reviewed, and she couldn't be certain what it would show. The prosecution had already proven themselves willing to twist the truth, so there was no guarantee that the footage would be the smoking gun she hoped for. Still, it was the best chance she had, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. As the court recessed, Sarah felt a surge of anticipation. The next day, the bailiff returned with the footage, and everyone gathered in the courtroom to view it. Sarah sat at the defendant's table, her palms sweaty, as she waited for the screen to come to life. The tension in the room was palpable, and she could feel the eyes of everyone on her. This was it. This was the moment that could change everything. The bailiff inserted the USB drive into a laptop, and the grainy footage flickered onto the screen. The scene was chaotic. Cars driving by, pedestrians walking down the street, the usual bustle of a quiet town. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the screen, her heart racing as she searched for the moment of truth. Then, there it was. The footage clearly showed the scene of the incident. Mark and Kyle were arguing, just as they had described in their testimony. But there was one major difference. Sarah wasn't anywhere near them. She was standing several feet away, clearly visible on the footage, frozen in place as the altercation unfolded. The footage confirmed what Sarah had been saying all along. She hadn't touched Mark, and she certainly hadn't shoved him into a mailbox. A collective gasp filled the room as the implications of the footage sank in. Even Mr. Blake, who had been so confident just moments before, seemed taken aback. He had been counting on the false testimonies to secure a conviction, but now the very foundation of his case had been shattered. Judge Harris stared at the screen, his face unreadable. For a moment, Sarah thought he might acknowledge the evidence and end the trial right then and there. But instead, he slammed his gavel down with a sharp crack. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice betraying a hint of panic. "This trial is not over yet." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The judge was clearly rattled, and for the first time in the trial, Sarah saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. She couldn't let up now. She had to keep pushing. The footage had proven her innocence, but she knew that the system would fight back. She wasn't naive enough to think that everything would be over just because the truth had been revealed. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady but firm, "I request that you dismiss the charges against me. The footage is clear. I wasn't involved in the altercation. I was nowhere near it." Judge Harris glared at her, his face reddening with anger. "We will see," he muttered under his breath, but even his words lacked conviction. For the first time, Sarah felt like she had the upper hand. The evidence was on her side, and she wasn't about to let the court sweep it under the rug. But there was no time to celebrate. The battle was far from over. The prosecution would surely try to discredit the footage, to claim that it was tampered with or that it didn't show the full picture. Sarah knew that this was just one victory in a much larger fight. But for now, she allowed herself a small moment of triumph. She had uncovered the truth, and for the first time in this whole ordeal, she felt like she had a real chance at winning. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations and murmurs of disbelief. Sarah sat at the defendant's table, her hands trembling slightly despite her outward calm. The traffic camera footage had done its job, casting a glaring light on the lies spun by the prosecution. The footage proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that she wasn't near the altercation when it occurred. She was, in fact, several feet away, frozen in shock as the events unfolded. For the first time since the trial began, Sarah felt like she had a real chance of walking out of that courtroom free, her name cleared. But Sarah knew better than to get too comfortable. The system that had once seemed so fair and just had proven itself anything but, and she wasn't about to let her guard down now. As much as the footage worked in her favor, she knew the prosecution would stop at nothing to salvage their case. They would do whatever they could to undermine her, to twist the narrative and ensure she was found guilty. It wasn't long before the next witness took the stand, Emily Brooks, a classmate of Sarah's who had allegedly witnessed the altercation. Emily had always been quiet and reserved, someone Sarah barely knew, but now her testimony had the potential to shift the entire case. Sarah wasn't prepared for what came next. Emily stood, looking pale and anxious as she glanced nervously at the prosecutor. Mr. Blake was already on his feet, ready to lead her through the testimony. "Emily," he began, his voice smooth and calculated, "can you tell the court what you saw the day of the incident?" Emily cleared her throat and nodded. Her voice was soft but steady as she began to speak. "I saw Sarah arguing with Mark. She was yelling at him, telling him to leave her alone. Then she pushed him. He stumbled, and I saw him hit his head on the mailbox." Sarah's stomach dropped. This wasn't what happened. This was a complete fabrication, a lie designed to support the prosecution's case. Sarah stared at Emily, her mind racing. Why was she lying? Sarah barely knew her, had never had a confrontation with her. What was Emily's motive? The room fell into a tense silence as Emily's words echoed through the courtroom. Sarah wanted to jump up and shout that it wasn't true, that Emily was lying, but she knew better than to interrupt the proceedings. Instead, she focused on keeping her composure, refusing to let the false testimony shake her. When it was her turn to cross-examine Emily, Sarah stood up from the defense table, her legs shaky but determined. She had to expose the lie. She had to make the truth known. As she approached the witness stand, she could see the fear in Emily's eyes, the way her hands gripped the edge of the stand as if she was trying to hold on to something. "Emily," Sarah began, her voice calm and steady. "We've known each other for months now. Can you tell me, have we ever had any sort of confrontation before this incident?" Emily hesitated, glancing down at her hands. "No," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Exactly," Sarah continued, her eyes never leaving Emily's face. "So why are you testifying that I pushed Mark when I wasn't even near him? Why are you saying things that aren't true?" Emily's gaze shifted nervously to the prosecutor, but Mr. Blake didn't intervene. He was watching the exchange, seemingly satisfied with the way things were going. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come out. She hesitated, her eyes darting back and forth between Sarah and the judge. "Did someone ask you to lie?" Sarah pressed. "Did Mr. Blake or anyone else tell you to say these things about me?" Emily's face turned red as she looked down at the floor, her voice trembling. I can't talk about it," she muttered, almost inaudible. Sarah stepped closer, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "Emily, you're under oath. You don't have to lie anymore. If someone pressured you to testify against me, now is the time to tell the truth." The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone was watching, waiting for Emily to speak. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the young girl squirm under the pressure. She could see the conflict in Emily's eyes, the way she wanted to speak but seemed afraid to. But just as Sarah was about to ask one more pointed question, Mr. Blake jumped to his feet, objecting. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a baseless accusation. The defense is badgering the witness." Judge Harris looked at Sarah, his expression cold and unyielding. "Sustained," he said, his voice sharp. "Move on, Miss Carter." Frustration burned in Sarah's chest. She had been so close. She had seen the truth in Emily's eyes, the guilt that was written across her face. But Judge Harris wasn't allowing her to push any further. He wasn't going to let Emily confess, not in front of everyone. Sarah returned to her seat, her mind reeling. What had caused Emily to lie? Was she being coerced? And if so, by whom? The questions swirled in Sarah's mind, but there was nothing she could do right now. She had to stay focused. There were still more witnesses to come, and the trial was far from over. As the day wore on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She knew there was more to Emily's testimony than met the eye. She had been too nervous, too uncomfortable during her answers. It was as if someone was forcing her to say these things, to put Sarah's fate in jeopardy. But who? And why? Later that night, as Sarah sat in her room, she couldn't stop thinking about Emily. She had to know the truth. She had to find out who was behind this. Emily wouldn't have lied unless someone had pushed her to do it. But who? Sarah knew that if she could get to the bottom of this, if she could expose the person who was manipulating Emily, she could tear apart the prosecution's case once and for all. The next day, Sarah went back to the library to do more research. She spent hours combing through legal texts, trying to find a way to prove that Emily's testimony had been tampered with. As she pored over the case, she found something that made her pause. It was a small detail, a reference to witness tampering in a previous case. Could it be possible that the same thing had happened here? Sarah knew it was a long shot, but she wasn't about to give up now. She had to find evidence of coercion, something that would expose the lie for what it was. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from Mrs. Jenkins, her trusted librarian-turned-mentor. "If Emily is lying, there's usually someone behind it. Keep following the trail." Sarah took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She knew what she had to do. The days following Emily's testimony were a blur of frustration and determination for Sarah. The court had adjourned for the evening, but Sarah couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. Emily's testimony had felt off, too rehearsed, too scripted. Something about the way she had spoken, the way she had avoided Sarah's eyes, had screamed of fear and uncertainty. It was clear that Emily was hiding something, and Sarah had no intention of letting it slide. Despite the fact that the judge had cut short her cross-examination, Sarah refused to give up. She spent the night lying awake in bed, her mind racing. Who was behind this? Who had convinced Emily to testify against her with such fabricated lies? She knew Emily wasn't the mastermind behind this. There had to be someone else, someone powerful, someone with the means to manipulate a scared teenager. Sarah couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to Emily's testimony than met the eye. The next morning, Sarah couldn't concentrate on anything. She tried reviewing her notes and preparing for the next day's proceedings, but all she could think about was the growing sense of injustice. How could she prove that Emily was lying without solid evidence? Emily's testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case, and without it, they would be left with nothing. But Sarah knew that the lies would continue unless she uncovered the truth. She had to find a way to expose whoever was pulling the strings behind the scenes. In the midst of her turmoil, Sarah received an unexpected message from Mrs. Jenkins. The elderly librarian, who had become her most trusted ally, had been following Sarah's case from the beginning. She had provided Sarah with invaluable resources, helping her navigate through the labyrinth of legal documents. This time, however, Mrs. Jenkins had something more to offer. The text was simple, but it made Sarah's heart race. "I found something. Meet me at the library tonight. It's about Emily." That was all the message said. Sarah didn't waste any time. She knew Mrs. Jenkins had been helping her every step of the way, but now it seemed like the librarian had uncovered something critical. Emily was hiding something, and Sarah felt a flicker of hope that Mrs. Jenkins might have found the key to unlocking the entire conspiracy. That evening, Sarah made her way to the library, her heart pounding in anticipation. As she entered, she saw Mrs. Jenkins sitting at one of the tables, a cup of steaming tea in front of her. The librarian looked up, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. But the smile quickly faded as Sarah approached. "I've been doing some digging, Sarah," Mrs. Jenkins began, her voice low. "And I found something in Emily's history. Something that might explain why she's lying." Sarah took a seat across from her, her mind racing. "What is it? What did you find?" Mrs. Jenkins leaned forward, lowering her voice even further. "I found a journal, Sarah. A journal belonging to Emily. I believe she's been keeping track of everything that's been happening around her. It's in her handwriting, and I'm certain it contains more than just personal thoughts. There are details in there. Things about the people who are pressuring her to testify against you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A journal? Of course. It made perfect sense now. Emily had been coerced into lying, and she had been documenting it all. The truth was in that journal. Sarah could feel her pulse quicken as she thought about the possibilities. If the journal contained evidence of manipulation, of witness tampering, then it could be the smoking gun she needed to tear down the entire prosecution's case. "Where is it?" Sarah asked urgently. Mrs. Jenkins hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if ensuring no one was listening. "I don't have it here, Sarah, but I know where you can find it. I've managed to get my hands on a copy of the journal. Emily's journal is crucial. It's a record of everything that's been happening. If you can prove its authenticity, it will change everything." Sarah nodded, trying to keep her excitement in check. "How do I get it? What do I need to do?" Mrs. Jenkins handed her a small, folded piece of paper. "Here's the address of a friend of mine who works at a local print shop. He'll be able to help you make a copy of the journal without drawing too much attention. But remember, Sarah, this is a big step. If you're caught with it, it could be disastrous." Sarah felt the weight of the situation settle over her. She was about to take a massive risk, but there was no other choice. She had to expose the truth, no matter what it took. With Mrs. Jenkins's help, she now had the means to gather the evidence she needed. The journal was the key. The next morning, Sarah made her way to the print shop. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the front door. She was taking a huge gamble, but it was the only option left. The world felt like it was closing in around her, but this was her chance to finally level the playing field. Inside the print shop, Sarah was greeted by an older man with graying hair and glasses perched on the tip of his nose. He looked up from his work and gave her a nod. "Mrs. Jenkins told me you'd be coming," he said, his voice low and measured. "You're the one looking for a copy of Emily's journal, right?" Sarah nodded. "I need to make sure it's safe, that it's copied correctly. Can you help me?" The man glanced over his shoulder, checking for anyone who might be watching. "Follow me," he said, leading Sarah into the back of the shop. The room was small, filled with machines and piles of paper, but it was quiet and secluded. Once they were inside, he pulled out a folder and handed it to Sarah. "Here it is. Take a look for yourself," he said, his voice hushed. Sarah opened the folder and carefully pulled out the journal. It was a small, worn notebook, with Emily's handwriting scrawled across the pages. As Sarah flipped through it, her eyes widened with shock. The journal was filled with notes, observations, and, most importantly, details about the pressure Emily had been under. There were mentions of phone calls, meetings with Mr. Blake, and instructions on what to say in court. Emily had been forced to lie. The evidence was right there in front of Sarah, and it was undeniable. "I'll make a copy for you," the man said, sensing Sarah's disbelief. "But be careful with it. Once it's out there, there's no going back." Sarah nodded, clutching the journal tightly. This was it. The proof she needed. She was about to change everything. As she left the print shop, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. She had found the truth. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. The journal might expose Emily's lies, but it wouldn't be enough on its own. Sarah needed to find a way to present this evidence in court, to make sure that it was taken seriously. She couldn't afford any more mistakes. The tension in the courtroom the next morning was palpable. Sarah stood at the defense table, her mind racing as she clutched the freshly copied journal in her hands. The words written in Emily's journal had confirmed what she had suspected all along. Emily had been coerced into lying. Someone powerful, had manipulated her to serve their own agenda. Sarah had the proof now, but she needed to use it carefully. One wrong move, and the system that had already tried to crush her might just find another way to bury the truth. She had spent the entire night preparing for this moment. The journal, Emily's written record of pressure and intimidation, was her key to exposing the lies and tampering that had been at the core of the prosecution's case. She knew the risks. If the journal was dismissed as irrelevant or inadmissible, it could hurt her chances. But if she could get it into the right hands, if she could make the court see the manipulation for what it was, she might just stand a chance at winning. The courtroom doors opened, and the proceedings began. Sarah's stomach churned as Judge Harris took his seat. The familiar smug expression on his face made her stomach drop, but she held her ground. This time, She wasn't going to let him or anyone else intimidate her. She had prepared too long, fought too hard, and she wasn't about to let the truth be ignored any longer. Mr. Blake stood confidently, ready to continue his relentless pursuit of a conviction. He had no idea that today would be different. Sarah had done her homework, and she was about to turn the tide in her favor. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the nervousness twisting inside her, "I would like to present new evidence that directly contradicts the prosecution's case." Judge Harris raised an eyebrow. "New evidence?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, standing taller. "This is a journal written by Emily Brooks, the key witness who testified against me. It contains details of the pressure she faced to testify falsely, including direct coercion by the prosecution." There was a collective gasp in the courtroom. Sarah could see the opposing attorney's face tighten in response, but she didn't let the reaction throw her off. She had the truth now, and it was time for everyone in the room to hear it. Without waiting for further instruction, Sarah approached the judge and placed the journal on the table in front of him. The pages were filled with Emily's handwritten notes, and as Sarah flipped through them, she highlighted the most damning entries, the moments where Emily described the phone calls and meetings with Mr. Blake. She described how she was told what to say, how to frame the events in such a way that it would make Sarah seem guilty, even though she wasn't. "This journal," Sarah continued, "details the manipulation and pressure that Emily was subjected to. She was coerced into lying about what happened that day, and it's all documented here. If I may, Your Honor, I would like to read an excerpt from it." Judge Harris glanced at the journal, then back at Sarah. "You may proceed," he said, though his voice lacked the usual condescension. Sarah took a deep breath and began reading aloud from the journal. She read passages that described Emily's fear, how she had been warned that her family would suffer if she didn't cooperate. There were detailed notes about the threats made against her, about the promises that everything would be taken care of if she just followed the script. The words were raw and honest, filled with a desperation that made it clear Emily had been pushed into a corner, forced to make a decision she never wanted to make. The room fell silent as Sarah read. Even the stenographer seemed to pause, her fingers hovering over the keys as she listened to Sarah's voice. The weight of the words was undeniable. Sarah could see Judge Harris shifting in his seat, his previously impassive face now betraying a flicker of uncertainty. When she finished reading, Sarah looked up at the judge, her heart pounding in her chest. "This is the truth, Your Honor. Emily was forced to testify against me. She didn't want to lie, but she was pressured into doing so. And I can prove it." There was a moment of stunned silence in the courtroom before Mr. Blake stood up, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. "Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to undermine the credibility of the witness. The defense cannot present this journal without verifying its authenticity. It's inadmissible." Sarah wasn't surprised by Mr. Blake's objection, but she was ready for it. She had anticipated that he would try to dismiss the evidence. He had no choice but to fight back, but his objection wasn't based on the truth. It was based on fear. He knew that this journal was the key to unraveling the case he had built, the case he was trying so desperately to win. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice strong, "I request a subpoena of the prosecution's email records. I believe we will find further evidence of witness tampering. If this journal is questioned, we can confirm its authenticity by cross-referencing the entries with other evidence in the case." Judge Harris took a long, hard look at the journal, his eyes scanning the pages. The silence in the room was suffocating as the judge considered the implications of Sarah's request. Finally, After what seemed like an eternity, he slammed his gavel down. "I'll allow it," Judge Harris said, his tone stiff. "The court will review these claims. If they prove to be valid, the consequences will be severe." A surge of relief washed over Sarah, but she knew better than to let her guard down now. This was a victory, yes, but it was only the beginning. The prosecution would fight tooth and nail to salvage their case, but now they were on the defensive. Sarah had the evidence. She had the truth on her side. As the judge ordered the subpoena of Mr. Blake's email records, Sarah felt the tension in the courtroom begin to shift. She had exposed the lies. She had called out the corruption. And now she was watching as the very foundation of the prosecution's case crumbled beneath her feet. The next few days were a blur of legal procedures, subpoenas, and waiting. The email records were subpoenaed, and the judge ordered an investigation into the allegations of witness tampering. Sarah continued to sit in the courtroom, her mind constantly racing as she thought about what would happen next. She knew the prosecution wouldn't give up easily. They would find some way to try and discredit the evidence. But Sarah had learned one thing during this process. She couldn't trust the system to fight for her. If she wanted justice, she would have to keep pushing, keep exposing the truth, no matter what it took. Then came the phone call. It was Mrs. Jenkins. "Sarah," she said, her voice urgent, "I've uncovered something. It's bigger than we thought." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What is it? What did you find?" "It's Greg Weston. He's been working with Mr. Blake on several cases. He's a private investigator who specializes in using underhanded tactics to manipulate witnesses and discredit defendants. I think he's the one behind the threats to Emily." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Weston. She had heard that name mentioned in passing, but she hadn't realized how deep the web of corruption ran. If Weston was involved, it meant that the entire case against her had been orchestrated from the very beginning. The stakes had just gotten a lot higher. "Do you have proof?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "I'm working on it," Mrs. Jenkins replied, "but you need to be careful. Weston has ties to some very powerful people. If he's behind this, he'll stop at nothing to protect himself." Sarah's mind raced as she thought about the next steps. She had to take action, but she couldn't do it alone. She would need to confront Weston, expose him for what he was, and bring the truth to light. But Sarah had never been more certain of one thing. She wasn't going to stop until she had justice. The days that followed were a blur of planning and strategizing. Sarah knew the case was finally coming to a head. The evidence in Emily's journal, coupled with the investigation into Greg Weston's involvement, had put the prosecution on the defensive. Weston's ties to the corrupt network within the legal system had only strengthened Sarah's resolve. This was no longer just about clearing her name. It was about exposing a web of deceit that had hurt far too many people. Mrs. Jenkins continued to provide invaluable assistance. Her knowledge of local records, legal databases, and connections helped Sarah piece together the puzzle. Weston's role in manipulating witnesses had become clearer, and every step they took to expose him felt like a step closer to truth and justice. Then came the moment of reckoning. The judge called for a final hearing, where all the evidence would be reviewed, and a decision would be made. The courtroom was packed with spectators, the media, and a sea of anxious faces. The tension in the air was thick, but Sarah stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her, her mind focused on the final goal: justice. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Harris took his seat. The moment Sarah had waited for had arrived. She was prepared for this. She had faced every obstacle, every lie thrown her way. Now, it was time for the truth to come out. "Miss Carter," Judge Harris said, his tone heavy as he looked at her. "You've presented a lot of evidence in your defense, much of which I've yet to fully review. But we are at a critical point in this case. You may now present your final argument." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had one shot at this. With Emily's journal in hand and Weston's involvement exposed, she knew the truth would prevail. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice clear and unwavering, "this case was never about me versus the system. It was about exposing corruption, about showing that the truth matters, even when the odds are stacked against you. I stand here today not as an inexperienced teenager, but as someone who has fought for what is right. My innocence is not just a matter of what happened that day. It's a matter of what is happening behind closed doors: manipulation, threats, and coercion. The prosecution tried to break me with lies, but I didn't back down. The truth speaks for itself." Sarah then laid out everything. She explained the content of Emily's journal, the timeline of events, and the undeniable evidence that proved witness tampering. She didn't hold back, naming Greg Weston and his involvement with the prosecution. The truth, Sarah knew, would cut through all the falsehoods. "And as for the prosecution," Sarah continued, "they've shown us nothing but a desperate attempt to secure a conviction at any cost. They've tried to intimidate me, undermine my defense, and use false witnesses to manipulate the outcome. But what they didn't count on was the truth. The truth doesn't bend to power. The truth is what will set us free." Mr. Blake's face had turned crimson. He stood up to object, but Judge Harris raised a hand, silencing him. The judge appeared deep in thought, clearly weighing the gravity of Sarah's argument. After a long silence, Judge Harris spoke. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, his voice more measured than before, "you've certainly presented a compelling case. And while the court cannot ignore the severity of your claims, it is not up to one individual, no matter how young, to overturn the workings of the legal system." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Had she done enough? "But," Judge Harris continued, his tone shifting, "you've provided substantial evidence, evidence that cannot be dismissed. The court has reviewed the traffic camera footage, the journal, and the connections you've uncovered. The claims of witness tampering are serious, and they warrant further investigation." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was happening. This wasn't just about a verdict. This was about exposing the corruption that had been hidden for so long. The judge turned to the jury. "The evidence presented today is enough to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. The jury will now deliberate on whether Miss Carter should be acquitted or whether further investigation is needed into the actions of the prosecution." The jury filed out, and the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Sarah sat there, her mind racing. She had come so far. She had done everything she could to uncover the truth, to clear her name. But now, it was out of her hands. Hours later, the jury returned. Sarah's palms were sweaty, her heart pounding in her chest. The foreman stood and approached the judge. "In the case of the People versus Sarah Carter," the foreman said, his voice steady, "the jury finds the defendant not guilty." The words echoed in Sarah's ears, and for a moment she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. But when the gavel slammed down, Sarah knew she had won. The courtroom erupted into applause, but Sarah's mind was spinning. She had done it. The truth had prevailed. And though her journey wasn't over, this was the moment she had been fighting for. The moment she could finally breathe again. As she stood up to leave, her mother rushed to her side, tears of joy streaming down her face. "You did it," she whispered, pulling Sarah into a tight hug. "I knew you could do it." Sarah smiled, her eyes misting with emotion. "We did it, Mom. We fought for the truth." With one last look at the courtroom, Sarah stepped outside, the weight of the trial lifting from her shoulders. She wasn't just a teenager anymore. She had become a symbol of resilience, of standing up for what was right, even when the world tried to crush you. The road ahead might not be easy, but for the first time, Sarah felt like she could face anything.